Advanced Studio Classroom is on the air. Join us today as we look at a resource that might help you understand your financial future. Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another Advanced Studio Classroom. I am your host for today. My name is Simon, and you are joining me for our June finance article. The title of our article today is Financial Focus, Online Resources Help when tackling complex financial issues. And over the next 2 days, we're going to be talking about two different resources like this. Today, of course, is June 5th, and so we're going to be working on the lesson for June 5th today. And you can follow along, as always, in your Advanced Studio Classroom magazine. Joining me in the studio for this lesson, I have two panelists. The first one is Josh Bickle. Welcome back, Josh.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's always a pleasure to be back here on Advanced Radio.
Josh, I always look forward to having you on the panel, too. You offer a whole lot of insights and interesting stories, so it's good to have you here. Our second panelist today is actually our special panelist because she works in business. Rebecca Kay, welcome back.
It's great to be here.
Rebecca, we are going to talk about futures today, probably the most complicated topic any of us have ever talked about when thinking about finances. Are you ready to bring us your wisdom on the topic?
Well, I have to be really honest. This is definitely not my forte, but I think all of us should be better at financial matters because this pertains to our future, about how much money we can save up. And someday when we retire, we all want to retire, even though we love working here at Studio Classroom. At one point, we do need to retire, and we want to make sure that we are in our best position when we retire. So these are important topics to talk about, even though this one is a tough one.
Now, Rebecca, this term, futures, it is a complicated one because you are right. When you were talking there, you actually used the word future in a couple of different ways. Because sometimes when we're talking about the future, we're talking about in time that we haven't lived through yet, right? Like
yes.
Future tense, for example. But other times when we're talking about the future, we're actually talking about a financial tool that is very complicated. Wow. Usually people think of it as being complicated and a little difficult to understand. But listeners, don't worry too much about that today because the focus of our article isn't understanding really what futures are. We're simply trying to look at a resource that's available to help you learn about them if you want to. And so I'd actually like to start our discussion today with a simple question for the two of you. And the question is, how did you learn to take care of your money? Rebecca?
Well, the honest truth is I think I'm still learning how to take care of my money. I don't think I'm an expert in taking care of my money, but a lot of knowledge that I gain about taking care of money is from my friends. My friends would say, oh, have you invested in this? Or, oh, would you consider putting your money in Asia? A lot of people put money into insurance, for example. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my knowledge is really coming from my friends.
I like your answer. It was an excellent answer, saying you haven't necessarily learned yet, but you're in the process of learning. I think that's very true and important to remember because we all make mistakes, right, when we're dealing with money. Josh, how about you?
That is a very good question. I would also like to say that I'm also learning and in the process of learning. Dealing with finances, I think, is something that is an ongoing process. Even the famous investor Warren Buffett still learns about what he is doing, although he is very good at what he does. I would say probably the first time that I was really interested in my financial future is when my mother, who was working as a nurse, decided to switch careers for a while and became a financial planner. So that's when I got my first money market account and also started looking at different ways that you can invest into the stock market without having to track individual stocks. So that's sort of how I started. But then I would also say, just like Rebecca, I do also talk to a lot of people and get a lot of information from friends and coworkers and mentors about finances.
Just quickly, Josh, tell us, you mentioned a money market account. That might be a term that's not familiar to all of our listeners. What is a money market account?
Well, it's a type of account that is similar to an index stock, meaning that you put money into an account and an account manager decides how they're going to use that funds in the account in order to invest in certain types of stocks. And then depending on how well those stocks do, how well that manager does, then you will earn a percentage of interest from their investments. But you are not choosing the individual companies that you invest in.
Okay, very quickly, there were a couple of other terms you used. You talked about the stock market and you talked about an index fund.
Well, we'll start off with the stock market. So that's the market that exchanges shares of various companies, or stocks that are being sold, and they are bought and sold, and people will hopefully buy them at a low value and be able to sell them at high value, but it does not always work out that way. But an index fund is a little bit different. So an index fund is also a managed fund, meaning that you're not buying individual stocks. You're buying into a company that is managing your investment. But an index is a choice of companies that establish sort of a certain baseline of stability in an industry. And usually index funds are what they call blue chip funds, meaning that they are for companies that are sort of standard. Like IBM would be considered a standard company. Boeing would be considered a standard company. Companies that have longevity, that will always have sort of viability or importance in the market, and you invest in a group of those types of companies with the idea that over time, all of those companies will increase in value.
Okay, so an index, some common names for indexes are things like the Dow Jones and the S&P 500, the Wiltshire 5000, and basically they're collections of companies on a list of companies. And when you get an index fund, you're basically investing in a tiny bit of each one of those funds. That's the idea, right? Okay, that brings us to our topic for today, the future. What is a future? Not the future, as in the tense, but what is a future? So let's get into our first reading today. It's called Futures for All. And listeners, you will find it on page 16 of your magazines. We're going to be reading from the left-hand column. So join us as we do that reading now.
Financial Focus. Online resources help when tackling complex financial issues. Futures for All. Did you think about futures markets when you ate your breakfast this morning? How about when you filled up your car with gas? You might not even know what derivatives are, but the fact is that the economy wouldn't work without them. When banks need to determine how many loans they can offer at a particular interest rate, they use futures markets. When airlines need to guard against surges in fuel costs, or cereal producers look to protect themselves from shocks to the supply of corn or grains, they turn to futures as well. Futures allow institutions to mitigate the potential damage caused by unexpected events or fundamental shifts in supply and demand.
Well, listeners, we've just had a taste, a hint of what the futures are, but we haven't had too much of a definition. Our reading starts off today with, did you think about futures markets when you ate your breakfast this morning? I will tell you, I did not think about futures this morning when I was eating breakfast. How about you, Rebecca?
I didn't have time to think about breakfast because I was in a big hurry to get to work on time.
Oh, no. Josh?
Well, I think I would like to consider that my life is sort of the image of I consult the financial index every morning as I'm eating my bowl of cereal, but I did not do that this morning either.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because in a lot of ways, this question isn't as ridiculous as you might think. A lot of people do check their investment accounts first thing in the morning when they wake up. I also do that. But for a lot of people, their investment accounts, especially if you're doing personal finance, don't really include these things, futures, very much. And so the second question, the answer for most of us would also be no. How about when you filled up your car with gas? Now, it's interesting because they mention two things here, two kind of industries producing food and producing gas that both really need futures, this financial tool. They both rely very heavily on this financial tool. So the point is we use futures and we benefit from these financial tools all the time without necessarily thinking about them or knowing about them. And so it continues on, this first paragraph, by saying you might not even know what derivatives are, and derivatives, of course, are the name of this category of financial tool. But the fact is that the economy wouldn't work without them. In the next paragraph, Josh, it tells us a little bit about some of the kinds of companies that use futures. Tell us about one of them.
Sure. So we start off here, I think, with a pretty familiar idea. When banks need to determine how many loans they can offer at a particular interest rate. So what sort of interest rate they will charge you for giving you money. They use the futures market.
Now, it's interesting there because I'm going to try to pick, as we go through this paragraph, some of the key words that give you hints about what these things are and how they work. And the key word there in that sentence you looked at, Josh, is the word determine. Mm-hmm. So futures help companies make decisions, right? Rebecca, as we continue on in that paragraph, we learn about another kind of company.
The airlines. Basically, when the airlines they decide the price of your ticket. A big part of the price of your ticket comes from the cost of the fuel.
Okay. And so here the key word is guard against surges. And by surge, we just mean something increasing very rapidly. Mm-hmm. And in this case, we're talking about fuel costs. We all know that sometimes you wake up in the morning, you check the news, and you find out that something has happened in some very distant country, and all of a sudden, the gas you are filling up your car with is very expensive. We all have this sort of experience. That is an example of a surge, how all of a sudden the price of something changes very dramatically. The third example they give us, Josh, is
that futures allow institutions to mitigate the potential damage caused by unexpected events like something happening in a country far, far away, or fundamental shifts in supply and demand.
Okay, and so the key word there is mitigate. Now, Rebecca, can you explain to us what does mitigate mean?
Mitigate means to make something less harmful.
That was really, honestly, Rebecca, I asked you that question because all I could think of was other confusing words like offset to explain what mitigate means.
Yeah, we're trying to make these vocab words as simple as possible.
That is a great, simple definition. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so as we get to the end of this reading, we get this impression of futures as being something that's basically like insurance. It seems like insurance to me. Is that how you read it?
Well, in some ways, yes. I also like how it started off here with breakfast cereal or your morning food and filling up your car, which is something you do every day. Because if we didn't have these futures markets, maybe you would be thinking about the price of cereal and the price of gas because there's a good chance it could change all over the place on a very, very quick basis without this kind of insurance as to how prices will change in the future.
Okay, so I guess the big difference here that we will obviously get to is that insurance tends to be something that people buy as individuals, whereas maybe insurance is actually using futures and derivatives to decide who to give insurance to and how much they should pay for that insurance, right? So we're talking about something that's deeper than just the insurance you get from your financial sales representative or whatever. That brings us to our second reading, listeners, and you can find that in the bottom part of the left-hand column on page 16. We'll continue reading from line 19 all the way through to the beginning of the third section. Let's do that listening now.
And because these financial tools are so critical, the derivatives industry recently joined forces to broaden the scope and reach of futures fundamentals. This new free resource, which can be found at www.futuresfundamentals.org, is helping learners of all levels understand how these markets work and why they matter. With futuresfundamentals.org, we now have a resource for market users, policymakers, educators, and students, as well as the general public around the world, to better understand how risk management markets work and why they matter to all of us every day, says Walt Lucan, President and CEO of Futures Industry Association, the leading global trade organization for the futures, options, and centrally cleared derivatives markets worldwide.
Welcome back, listeners. Now, we've now gotten to the end of our second reading, but we haven't actually given you a simple, clear definition of what futures are. And I'll be honest, that's probably because we're trying to avoid this difficult discussion. Futures are a thing that even people who work with futures often don't fully understand. And that's the difficulty of the topic. Josh, you give us your definition, then we'll let Rebecca add to it, and then I'll chime in at the very end. What's a future?
That's a very good question. And I think you're right. Even people who work in the futures market sometimes have a really hard time explaining it to other people. So that's why having sort of this resource of infographics is good. But trying to put it simply, futures is sort of there are two different ends or two different aspects to the futures market. You have the people who are producing things like corn or wheat or gas, and you have people who are buying those things in order to be used in other ways. So the futures market is both people who sell betting that or taking contracts at providing their products at a certain price, and that people who are going to buy those things in the future at that time agreeing on a set price that helps them sort of mitigate, like we said before, the fluctuations or the changes that can happen in the market. So it helps both the people who are producing stuff like grain and also people who are buying things like grain.
So let me throw out a very simple summary sentence then before we get Rebecca to chime in. So basically a future is an agreement to buy or sell something at a set price in the future. So you decide today what price you're going to pay 6 months from now or a year from now or whatever. And so that's very simply what a future is. But we've been hearing about how it's so essential and so necessary for companies. So Rebecca, when you add to our definition, can you tell us, how is it that companies would use this to their benefit?
Well, for example, we were talking about fuel a little earlier, about airlines and fuel. And one example I can think about is the airline company needs to set the price of their tickets for people buy in advance, maybe like I know I do, maybe 6 months in advance, the ticket, or maybe even a year in advance for some people. But right now when I'm buying the ticket for 6 months in advance, the ticket price is already on the screen when I buy. But the problem is the airline company needs to decide how much is the cost of fuel. So if the airline company decides to buy, they have to say, okay, how much would the price of oil be a year from now or 6 months from now? The oil price has to be stable. But like we mentioned earlier, maybe there'll be a conflict in the Middle East or somewhere in the world that causes the oil price to suddenly go up a lot. Then if the oil company did not buy futures, they did not have, not the oil, the airplane company did not know the future price of oil, and that means they could lose a lot of money for the cost of the ticket.
Okay. Now, I'll be honest, I have actually toyed with futures in my personal life. And for years, I could not understand why you would lock in a price, like set the price today. Because my feeling was, well, there's a chance that it could be cheaper. Like if I buy my airline ticket today, it might be cheaper 3 weeks from now. And then, I'll feel like, oh, I got a bad deal or whatever. But the real benefit of something like a future is that it lets you set a budget. So you know how much money you're going to need to accomplish this task, and you can set everything up for doing your business. You know how much you need to charge for your products over the next period of time. You know how much it will cost you to produce your products over that period of time. And so if you're thinking about it in terms of being the airline offering a ticket at a price, it's clear why they would want to know how much fuel will cost, because then they can make sure they're going to make their profit from the price they get from you today. But what
Right.
wasn't clear for me for a long time is why you would buy a futures contract when you're buying something. But the answer is simply, well, maybe you're saving money for your trip, so you want to put together a budget and you want to know how much the ticket will be. And so usually people don't buy futures in their personal lives.
Well, actually, that really depends on how much of the market you play, whether you buy futures. I would say the reason we need more resources on futures is it's a very tricky market to navigate. And that's why most people in their personal accounts, they don't go into futures. Like that's usually people who work with futures are more advanced in investing because there are a lot of fluctuations and there are a lot of skills you need to manage a futures account. How about you, Josh? Have you ever played with futures?
I have not. So futures is one of the things that I also feel in order really to get any kind of value out of buying futures is that you need to be able to invest quite a bit. So you would have to have a good amount of investment funds that you'd be able to be willing to lose.
There you go. So nonetheless, that's what a future is. It basically gives you a guaranteed price in the future for something you're going to need to buy, or alternatively, something you're going to need to sell. So for example, if you're a farmer and you are feeding your cows today and you want to know how much money you will get for these cows when you sell them, you could get a futures contract to agree to sell them. That's the idea. So as we go into this second reading, bear that definition in mind. Our reading here started with, because these financial tools are so critical. The derivatives industry recently joined forces to broaden the scope and reach of futures fundamentals. Now, the point here being, we know that these futures are critical for companies to do their business, right? But the derivatives industry, so all of these different businesses that are involved in selling these types of products and managing these products and various things, have joined forces. So they're now working together, and they're working together to broaden the scope and reach of futures. Now that actually, we've marked scope as a word to teach here, but the phrase itself, the scope and reach of something, that's a fairly common phrase, right? Josh, can you tell us what that means?
Yeah, so it just means how widely something will really affect or how wide you take something into consideration.
Okay, excellent stuff. So they've basically joined together to set up a resource, and the resource is called Futures Fundamentals. It's a free resource, and you can find it on the internet. It's at www.futuresfundamentals.org, and the idea is that it helps everybody. It actually even has a section on the webpage for teachers if you want to teach about futures to younger students or, I guess, students of any age. You can click on that and get help with that. And so as we move over to the right-hand column, we get a quote. Rebecca, tell us about this quote.
This quote is made by the president and CEO of the Futures Industry Association, which is the association that promotes futures. So the president, Walt Lucan, basically in the quote says that this website, the end goal is to help all different kinds of people, from people who make the policy to educators to students to just people like you and me, understand better futures so they can understand how risk management markets work.
That's right. And it goes on. There's one more word there that is one of our vocabulary words. It lists a number of these tools: futures, options, and centrally cleared derivatives markets they talk about. Those are basically all kind of closely related financial tools. That's the idea. That brings us to our third reading. It's under the section, How Does the Site Work? Let's get to that reading now.
How does the site work? Futures Fundamentals breaks down the who, why, and what of futures markets in an accessible and fun way. The site is divided into 3 sections, each featuring the role of derivatives as told through stories, interactive infographics, videos, and quizzes. Activities first break down key financial concepts, including microeconomics and supply and demand. Visitors then learn how familiar tasks, such as buying a home or car, are affected by futures markets. In addition, after those initial lessons, visitors can try their hand at a trading simulator. Even more importantly, the site also provides teachers with modules to teach these economics lessons in their classrooms, all online and at no cost.
So how does the site work? Actually, all three of us have been to the website, right, panelists? It's a fairly user-friendly site. It's easy to find things on, and it looks pretty good. It uses some nice infographics and little cartoon-like pictures. Josh, tell us, what are the main things the site tries to teach you?
Well, it really tries to break down or to go from a very complicated idea into a simple idea, the who, what, and why of future markets, and sort of, like it says here, an accessible and fun way. And I did look at the website, like you said, and I agree that the website is built in such a way that it seems like things are pretty accessible, pretty easy to get into.
Okay, they have 3 different sections, and then they teach you different things about derivatives, and they do that by using stories, interactive infographics. Now, an infographic is like a picture that contains information for you, and videos and quizzes and some different things like that. So it tells us in the second paragraph here, activities first break down key financial concepts, including microeconomics. Now, quickly, Rebecca, what's microeconomics?
Well, microeconomics is micro means very small. So microeconomics just means economics on a smaller scale.
Yeah, so we usually think of economics as being like a country or what's happening with the whole market. Microeconomics is more the economics of deciding things at a company level or as an individual. So like you said, Rebecca, on a very small level, and dealing, of course, with things like supply and demand. It says visitors then learn that familiar tasks like buying a home or car are affected by futures markets. And then, of course, after you learn this information, you have a chance to use some application. What does it tell us about that, Josh?
So you get to try your hand at a trading simulator.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of fun, right? You get to see if you can make some money without actually investing any money.
You get to buy and sell, but not lose any money, right? What a great thing. And then at the very end of this section, it tells us that even more importantly, the site also provides teachers with modules to teach these economics lessons to their classrooms, all online and at no cost. And that, I think, is probably the most important part here. This may not be true all around the world, but particularly in the West, financial education as it deals with economics and personal finance is often very, very poor, leaving people without very much idea at all of what to do with their money or how. And so any sort of resource that helps people understand the financial markets and the things that are happening with their money is probably a good resource. Well, that brings us to the end of this article, Futures for All. Listeners, please be sure to join us for our next lesson as we continue on with our financial article for June. We're going to be looking at credit tomorrow, so be sure to join us for that program. Until then, I'm Simon.
This is Josh.
Rebecca.
Saying bye for now.
Bye.
Goodbye.